This is the last section in Mark chapter 11. I do want to encourage you to participate in our event tomorrow night. It's a great opportunity for us to serve the community. There's been a lot of sharing and comments and all these type of things for non-city church people about the event tomorrow, so I'm anticipating there being a large crowd of people here. And so the whole riddle about what to do with candy, I thought with candy is just take it and pass it out. I guess I was asked just like she didn't know what we were going to do with the candy. Isn't that the goal, just to pass out the candy? I think what you're saying is the candy that was brought to the church, what do we do with it, right? There's a lot of candy. So bring your candy, if you have candy. And then here's an idea. There's a lot of events tonight as well, a lot of trunk or treats. So just take your kids to, or don't take your kids, go to the trunk or treats, get candy, bring it tomorrow night. We went to the two down the Bank Street and the 2nd Street events on Thursday night. They were doing downtown trick-or-treating, and so we have a basket of candy that Levi did not know that he's donating to the trunk or treat tomorrow night. I'm just teaching him early about taxes. Like 35% of this candy is going to someone else, so just learn now. All right, we're in Mark chapter 11. We're going to start with this question. How many of you have some type of issue with authority in life in general? Dave Ward, hold your hand up high. Issues with authority. I should not have said that as Matavia was taking a drink of water or coffee. Issues with authority. How many of you ever have challenged authority and come out on the losing end of that challenge? Okay, so maybe you spent a night somewhere or paid a fine to someone because you issued a challenge against authority that you simply lost because you're not the person in charge. When I was a younger person, preteen years, I'll say I was probably about 10 or 11. I don't know if Dad and Mom even remember this story. But my dad was pastoring the Trinity Church in Greenville, North Carolina. We were living there. I was kind of a typical PK in a lot of ways. Exerted my will and got in some trouble along the way. And there was one Wednesday night. We had normal kind of Wednesday night service. And I was in this Wednesday night class. And I think the guy's name that was teaching the class was Ray, if I remember correctly. And I decided I was going to act up during the class. This was not uncommon. And so Ray pushed back on my acting up and corrected me in front of the class, to which my response was, I'm the pastor's kid. I'll do what I want, and I'm going home. And we lived about, a mile from the church, and so I got up, left the class, and started walking home in the middle of church, challenging his authority. Ray decided it would be a good idea to bring in an authority figure that I would listen to. So I didn't even make it out of the parking lot before my short, high-energy mom caught me and told me I wasn't going home. I think the words that I used to Ray is, you're not my dad. You can't tell me what to do. I can tell you by the end of the night, I kind of wish Ray was my dad. I realized I was not the person in charge and learned a lesson in the process. We all have issues with authority. We are born sinners, so we all have issues with people over us. We want to do what we want to do. We want to be in control. We want to call our own shots. We want to live life like we want to live it. From the time you are kids, you are born with this natural tendency. Kids want what they want when they want it. Half of the issues that you run into as a parent is over that issue, right? Kids wanting what they want, when they want it, how they want it, on their time frame, because they're natural born sinners. We all struggle with authority issues. By the way, it doesn't stop when you're a kid. We're all the same way. We want what we want. This all started with our original parents in the Garden of Eden. The very first temptation was an authority issue. And we're going to come back to that at the end of our message. So the dispute between Jesus and the religious elite in the text that was read this morning is at its heart an authority issue. If you were here last Sunday, if not, you can go back and re-listen to any of these messages through Mark's gospel. On the previous day, Jesus created quite a stir in the temple when he went in and cleared the deck. He pronounced judgment on the religious establishment over the temple, and this incident initiates a series of conflicts that Mark records between Jesus and the religious leaders. We'll see this over chapter 12 and even into chapter 13. So let's jump back into our text, verse 27. And they, this will be Jesus and the disciples, came again to Jerusalem, and he was walking in the temple. And the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. So this is the third day that Jesus is in the temple. A lot of scholars believe that this is Holy Week, and so if this is Holy Week, this is Tuesday. I have water right here. Susan, don't get up. I have water. Susan normally fetches my water. I use the word fetch. That's impressive. This is Tuesday of Holy Week in Jerusalem. Jesus is once again in the temple, and on this particular day, he's confronted by a group of chief priests, scribes, and elders. Now, this group is most likely a part of a larger group that is called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, think of it in terms of kind of the Supreme Court of Judaism in the time of Jesus. There were 71 members in the Sanhedrin. They had considerable religious influence, political influence, and even legal clout. The Sanhedrin was kind of this buffer in between the Roman authorities under which the Israelites were under the control. They were this buffer between the Roman authorities and the Jewish people. There was a lot of back-scratching that went on. The Roman authorities simply did not want the people to be a nuisance, and so they allowed the Sanhedrin to kind of control their own people, like we just do not want to hear from them, right? And then the Jewish people obviously were always kind of in this mindset of revolting against the Romans because they didn't like being in captivity. And so the Sanhedrin kind of served as this buffer in between the people, a lot of favors, a lot of back and forth. They were kind of old school lobbyists. They were trying to keep a lot of different parties happy. And so that was the role of the Sanhedrin. Well, the ministry of Jesus, as we've walked through Mark, has captured the attention of this powerful group. The most powerful religious leaders. And what we've learned is that they're going to do whatever is necessary, whatever is required, to put an end to this defiant rabbi, this controversial man named Jesus. Jesus is a marked man. He's marked for death. Traps have been set, snares have been laid, and they all have one purpose: destroy Jesus. He is a threat. And they will not stop at anything until he is eliminated. Man, that sounded like a Netflix series promo or something. They're out to get Jesus, to kill him at all costs. And so that's the scene as this group approaches Jesus in the temple. Verse 28, they say to him, and again, there's some contemplation behind this, like they're trying to come up with this question that will get Jesus. By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them? This question posed by these religious leaders regards authority. The original word for authority here is exousia. It means to exercise power or control. The authority question is not a new one. Jesus has repeatedly displayed divine authority in his teachings, in his miracles. The crowds have often responded in saying how much authority that Jesus has. This is a person that speaks with authority and acts with authority. So the authority question is not a new one. And now here in the temple, which is the most authoritative place of that day, by the Sanhedrin, which is the most authoritative body in Israel, Jesus is questioned about the source of his authority. This is an issue of grave concern for the religious establishment. What right do you have to say the things that you say? What right do you have to do the things you do? Show us your credentials, Jesus. The implication here by this group of religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, is we have the power, we have the authority, and we have not granted you any authority or power. You have no status, you have no right, you have no claim to authority. The trap here is to coerce Jesus into attributing his authority to God. They're trying to have the crowds picture Jesus in some way that will cause them to question him. And to claim to speak and act with the authority of God would be considered blasphemy. It would also be considered grounds for capital punishment. By whose authority are you doing these things? Like they think like this is a straightforward question for Jesus. And if he answers in the wrong way, then maybe it gives us some grounds to pursue our ultimate goal, which is to destroy him. By the way, this is the very issue that they'll bring up at the end of Jesus' life in a few short days. The authority question is the one that they're going to bring to the table to try to get Jesus crucified. And so they ask this question, hoping that Jesus will give a straightforward answer. As we read earlier, he does not. He asks a question in return. Jesus says to them, 29, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. So it was a very common technique for Jewish rabbis to answer a question with a question. Questions to answer questions. Anybody else use this technique? Your parents use it. Somebody uses it. Every time I ask you a question, you got a question in return. Spouses. Okay. All of us have those type of people in our life, right? The rabbi answers questions with questions. There used to be the old folklore of the Jewish rabbi that was asked the question by one of his students. Why do you always answer questions with a question? To which the rabbi replied, why not? Jesus counters with a very simple question. Was John's baptism from heaven or from men? Notice Jesus only gives two options here. From God or from man. He does not appeal to either of the well-known rabbinic schools of that day. He does not appeal to the law, the Torah. He does not appeal to the temple. Jesus gives only two possible sources for John's ministry. Either it was from God or it was from man, from humans. And Jesus' question cannot be answered by the religious leaders by appealing to religious traditions or their teachings or their protocol or their systems or their structures. You see, Jesus is not under the control of the Sanhedrin. He's not under their authority. As a matter of fact, he is over them. His question is evidence of the very authority about which he is being questioned. Jesus goes straight to the heart of what they are wanting to know, and he forces them to face the focus of John's ministry, which is to point people to Jesus. If you want to talk about John, this is the baptizer. If you want to talk about John the baptizer's ministry, let's talk about it. What was John's purpose, Jesus is really implying? That was to point people to him. John's ministry was all about Jesus. Remember, it was at the baptism of Jesus by John that what happened? The heavens parted, the Spirit descended like a dove, the Father spoke from the heavens and affirmed Jesus as his beloved Son in whom he is pleased, right? The baptism of Jesus by John was the event that launched the ministry of Jesus. It's the event that established the divine authority of Jesus by God. It was the event where God said, this is my Son. He has divine authority. I am pleased with him. So here's what Jesus is doing. A decision about John is really a decision about Jesus. And so the Sanhedrin find themselves in quite a dilemma here, right? Quite a conundrum, quite a pickle. Why did pickle ever get put into this idea? Find yourself in quite a pickle. What does that even mean? Is a pickle constantly confused? I don't know. But that's where they find themselves. Am I a cucumber, pickle? What am I, right? The confused pickle. I've been having too much Halloween candy or something. Jesus forces the religious leaders to face who he is. Is this from heaven? Is this from man? They are faced with who Jesus claims to be. They are faced with what God is doing through Jesus. And 2 times Jesus says, answer me, answer me. He puts them on the spot. He insists, answer me. So they scratch their heads and try to figure out how to answer. Verse 31, here's their dilemma, here's their pickle. They discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say that, why then did you not believe him? Remember what John claimed. He claimed that Jesus is the Messiah, the chosen one. But shall we say from man? They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. And this word all here is very inclusive, meaning like everyone had this opinion that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. This word discuss, they discussed it among themselves. It's used 7 times in Mark's gospel. And every time it's used, it's always in the context of people trying to escape or elude the authority claims of Jesus. They're always trying to skirt the claim that Jesus has on their life. So what they do is they basically switch to politician mode, don't they? They choose convenience over truth. They choose expediency over confession. You see, here's the dilemma. A decision for John, if they say it was from heaven, then that aligns them with Jesus. But a decision against John, if they say it was from man, that pits them against the crowd. Because the crowd believes that John was from God. So instead of committing either direction, they just bail on the entire conversation. We do not know, they say. Maybe they should have said, we are unwilling to know. You see, the religious leaders are pretenders. They admit that they are unable to tell the difference between what is from God and what is from man. Again, in our minds, in our modern culture, this is kind of how we feel sometimes about politicians now. Like, where do they stand? And the story changes, it seems, with each interview. This is not a good look. It's not a good look for the religious leaders. It's all over the social media and the news this week about a debate that took place with a guy that seemed to be confused on the debate stage, and he was asked a direct question about, I believe the issue was fracking, which seems to be a big hot topic in today's political climate. And they were asked, what is your opinion about fracking? He was like, I'm in favor of fracking. I've always been in favor of fracking. To which the questionnaire responded, well, 2 years ago you said you were against fracking. Now you're saying you're for fracking. It wasn't a good look. It wasn't a good look to say, I'm for this and against this, and then you're caught in that dilemma. And that's kind of where the religious leaders are. They're caught in the space in the in-between. And so their only response is, we do not know. Again, religious leaders, political leaders, all right, these are the guys that people go to. This is the elite. This is the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, and their response is, we do not know. Well, if you don't know, who does know? We do not know. So, like political hacks, the fear of popular opinion drives their decision. And they're unwilling to commit themselves. And in response, Jesus is unwilling to commit himself. So here's what Mark does. He paints this picture of Jesus engaged in this verbal dispute with the most powerful and influential leaders in Jerusalem. And Jesus is not just holding his own, he leaves them dumbfounded. And they want him dead for it. They want him murdered for it. But instead of retreating, Jesus confronts their duplicity by telling a story. We'll see this story next Sunday about these religious leaders. But here's what I want to do in our message today. I want to talk about two ways as we end this message, two ways that we are wired like the religious leaders in this story. Now, all of us are wired like the religious leaders. Way number one, we all have a built-in, ingrained, innate aversion to authority. We all have authority issues. We are born with them. We are born with them. And this ingrained rebellion goes back to our original parents and the moment that sin entered the picture. What was the original temptation? Let's relive it. Genesis 3. Now the serpent, of course this is Satan in the Garden of Eden. The serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, notice his exact verbiage here, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. And here's the temptation. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. And then you, here's the phrase, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it was a delight to the eyes. And then here's the key, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. She took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So we revisit Genesis 3 to be reminded of this original temptation. What is Eve or Satan pitching Eve? It is not better food options. It's not, I know you've been eating from all of these trees out here with all this delicious fruit, but you've not tried this delicious apple. We never read it's an apple, but we always make it an apple for some reason. You've never tried this piece of delicious fruit. It's not about the fruit. It's not about the taste of the fruit. The temptation is, he is tempting her with autonomy and self-independence, self-sufficiency. You can be like God. You don't have to live under anybody's control, anyone's authority. You see, God is the only one with true autonomy and self-sufficiency. God is the only being, as the creator and sustainer of the universe. God is not accountable to anything or anyone. He has absolute authority over all things. He is the creator and we are not. He's the only one that has complete self-sufficiency and autonomy. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need you. He's not accountable to us. He's the creator. He makes all things. And he's the only one that fits that category. God and God alone. Satan's temptation was not about the fruit. He entices Eve with the idea that she can be like God. Completely autonomous and completely self-sufficient. That she can live independently of the authority of God. What is he appealing to? He is appealing to the ingrained desire to sit on the throne of my own heart. That I want to be in charge. I want to be in control. You see, at its core, sin is about I. Even the word sin, S-I-N, puts the I in the center. That sin is about putting the big I in the center. It is selfishness at its core. Sin makes life all about me, my wants, my needs, my desires, my feelings. I want my way. I want to write my own rules. I want to control my own life. Every sin, I've said this before and often at City Church, every sin is really about idolatry of the heart. It's about bending the knee to some god other than the God. Many times we picture idolatry as kneeling to some stone or metal or golden image of some false god, but idolatry is really about bending my heart toward anything other than God Himself. Small g gods, we call them, little gods who take the place of the big God. And that's what sin is. It is an authority issue, an authority struggle. Like the question for us when it comes to sin and authority issues is like, who sits on the throne of my heart? What sits on the throne of my heart? In this moment, who sits on the throne of my heart? And every time that we sin, in that moment, we're allowing something or someone to sit on the throne of our heart other than God. If it's my convenience, if it's my comfort, if it's this lust that I have, this desire that I have, this person that I have elevated to a status that he or she does not deserve to be, if it's in that moment, it's yielding my knee, it's allowing something or someone to sit on the throne of my heart in that moment. Every time we say yes to temptation, we are saying no to God as the sovereign ruler and sovereign Lord of our hearts and lives in that moment. And that's what happens in the Garden of Eden and what has happened to every birth, every person who has ever lived since Adam and Eve, is that we have bent our knees to the God of self. That's what sin is. An authority issue. Who gets my worship? Who gets my devotion? You see, if I am the ultimate authority in my life, Paul says, I will exchange what is reserved exclusively for God for creation. That I will begin to worship created things. I will begin to give my devotion to created things, to creatures and created beings, and not the Creator, God Himself. That I will begin to serve created things and creatures and not the Creator, God Himself. Paul calls it an exchange. That you're exchanging authority. I am bowing to the idols of comfort or pleasure or power or control. I crave the applause and the praise of people over God, which is what we see in our text. And the second way that we are like the religious leaders in this text, not only we want control, we have this aversion to authority, but we tend to fear people more than God. We tend to keep our eyes focused on the horizontal over the vertical. I mean, think about these religious leaders. They had absolute freedom in religious matters. They had powerful influence in political matters. So the Sanhedrin lived with this constant tension of trying to keep the people happy and maintaining a good relationship with the Roman captors. Their ultimate value, their ultimate identity was found in maintaining their power, maintaining their authority. And so they were willing to compromise and ignore the truth even when it was staring them in the face. They ultimately feared people more than they feared God. And their identity was found in the opinions of people and the praise of others. The filter by which they lived life was power and influence. Let me put it in terms that we can relate to and understand. Their life filter was likes and shares and positive opinions. Their desire for approval stood at the heart of who they are. Our desire for approval stands at the heart of who we are as sinners. Our life tends to be more controlled by what people think about us than what God desires for us. We like to be liked, don't we? No, it's like, yeah, I want to be the guy nobody likes. That's not what I'm talking about. We like to be liked. We crave attention. We desire approval and praise. We said it a few weeks ago like this. We are glory thieves, that we tend to steal what belongs only to God and put it on ourselves. We seek after what only God deserves. His glory, His praise, His worship, His devotion. We want those things, just like Eve in the garden. And so we buy into the lie that our satisfaction and our happiness and our fulfillment and our success and our contentment is found in what others think about us or what the creation can give us. We expect the creation, whether it's something or someone, we expect creation to provide for us what only the Creator can give. And so we look to our spouse, or we look to our kids, or we look to a job, or we look to an addiction, or we look to stuff, or we look to convenience, or comfort, or vacations, or driving a vehicle, or living in a certain neighborhood. We look to created things, creaturely things, to give us what only God can provide. And guess what? They will fall short every single time. Your spouse, as awesome as they may be, cannot give you what only God can provide. Part of the issues that we see over and over and over and over again in marriage conflict is spouses looking to their spouse to give them only what God can give them. To give them satisfaction or happiness or fulfillment or contentment at a level that's reserved for God and God alone. And we are natural born sinners in this area, aren't we? That we are wired in this direction. It is why we have witnessed again and again and again in the life and teachings of Jesus in Mark's gospel that kingdom living is upside down living. It's upside down living. That the way of the cross is to die to myself. The way of the cross is to live under the rule and reign of Jesus, to seek Him above everything and everyone. Now, here is the good news of the gospel. The good news of the gospel is living under His authority and seeking His kingdom first is the true path to life, is the true path to meaning, is the true path to purpose. The path to joy and fulfillment is not autonomy and independence and self-sufficiency. The path to joy and fulfillment is dependence and reliance upon the Creator and Giver of life. Now notice I did not say dependence and reliance upon one of His creatures. Notice I did not say reliance or dependence upon something that God has created. I said reliance and dependence upon the Creator and the Creator alone. Because He alone is the giver and sustainer of life. I thought about Jesus' teachings in John 15. And I was thinking through this message and this idea. And we'll end with this text. Flashback to the Belief Project. The Belief Project was a series that we did through the Gospel of John. You think Mark took a long time? Oh my goodness. John, I started John when I was like 17. Which means it took a grand total of 2 years. Jesus in John 15. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away. Every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes it that it may bear more fruit. Okay, so listen to the description of this vine that is planted in Jesus. It bears more fruit. Okay, so it's the idea of producing. Already you are clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself. There's that independence we're always looking for. There's no fruit bearing in independence and autonomy. It only happens being abiding in Christ. It cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, Jesus says. You are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, what? You can do nothing. There is no independence and no self-sufficiency and no autonomy outside of who Jesus is. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask what you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. So there's this idea of being loved by God. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you. And look at this last phrase, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. Think about what Jesus describes in these verses that we so are pursuing naturally in life. He describes life. He describes production. He describes fulfillment. He describes joy. He describes love, like being loved and loving others. He describes connection. Man, these are things that we give our lives going after. We desire these things by nature. And yet as sinners, we tend to pursue these things through independence and self-sufficiency and autonomy and trying to take control of our own lives. And what Jesus invites us into is abiding. This word abide means to make your home in. To make your home in me, Jesus says. To live life under my rule and reign. To make our home in Jesus. This is where we find contentment of the soul. That's not driven by popular opinion or the fleeting praise of other broken sinners, but from the creator and sustainer of life. You see, it takes us all the way back to the garden. Back to Genesis 1 and 2. The story of Adam and Eve is this. True life, true living was not found outside the garden. That life was defined by brokenness and suffering and sin and shame and heartache and hurt. And ultimately it was defined by death. That was life outside the garden. That's the life that we experience now, right? Outside the garden. Suffering, shame, guilt, conflict. That is life outside the garden. That's the life of independence and autonomy and self-sufficiency. It is life outside the garden. That's not where true life was found. True living was found inside the garden. Inside the garden, under the gracious and the good authority of a loving Father. And that is where the redemptive story is taking us. It takes us back to the garden. It's why Jesus came. It's why he lived a sinless life. It's why he died an obedient death. It's why he was raised in triumphant life, so that we might live in harmony with God and with each other. It is the purpose for which you are created. Now, why is this difficult for us? I'm going to say this and I'm done. This whole thing about authority and authority issues, like I preach on this and it makes sense to us, and yet we still wrestle with it. And here's why we wrestle with it. We wrestle with it because we have lived and we experience a broken idea of authority. We live in a broken world, and we equate authority many times with injustice, abuse, control, power. These are the things that we tend to associate with authority because it's a broken idea of authority. And yet, Jesus, through the work of the cross and the resurrection, is redeeming, is restoring what it means to live under the authority of a good and gracious King. You see, there is one whose authority is not broken. It is not evil. It is not self-serving. It is not driven by an agenda. It is not abusive. There is one who is for you, who is in your corner, who desires for your life to be full and filled with vibrancy and life and purpose and meaning. There is one who died for our brokenness and sin. And living under His rule and reign is where we discover life and meaning and purpose that is not tainted by the broken ideas of authority that has hurt many of us, many of you. There is one whose rule and reign is a rule and reign of peace and love and joy and fulfillment. And we find those things not by pushing against His authority, but by living under His rule and reign. Back to the garden. Perfect relationship between God and humans, humans and each other, and humans and the created world which God has created around us, where we will live for all eternity under His rule and reign. Authority issue? Me too. Let's yield and surrender to the one whose authority brings life to our broken souls. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Jesus, thank you that you can be trusted, that your authority is not broken, but your authority breathes life and goodness and grace and mercy into our lives. May we constantly be brought back to the gospel that reminds us, that announces to us the good news that Jesus has died and has been raised back to life so that we might experience the goodness of your rule and reign. Father, we confess our tendency to push against your authority. We resemble Eve and Adam. We seek independence and self-sufficiency when what we were created for is reliance and dependence upon the Creator God. And so draw us back into that relationship again and again. Remind us of our need for you, our dependence upon you, knowing that you are a good and gracious King. May we live under your rule and reign in our hearts and lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.